Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is Concepts Lecture number 9, Space and Form. I'll talk first about space and then matter and form together, and then some non-Western concepts of space and form. Space and form, the expression, it's a combination that's used mostly in mid-20th century texts. It's really a part of formal analysis. In this lecture, I'm making these, treating them as separate concepts in art theory. But first, is space transcultural? These days we're trained to say nothing is transcultural. Every idea, every practice belongs to a specific times and places. But the art world uses space as if it is universal, transhistorical, and transcultural. In other words, the word space is used in English language descriptions of art of any culture. It's as if the word is somehow exempt from history, that it exists somehow outside of history. There is a history to that assumption, and there is also a history to the word space. Textbooks on history of art use the word space for all periods, but there is special emphasis on the Italian Renaissance because that's when linear perspective was first used. Even now, some people think that Renaissance artists, architects, and mathematicians invented perspective, and other people think they discovered it, the way Einstein discovered E equals mc squared, or Pythagoras supposedly discovered his theorem. So I have 5 slides on perspective before we return to the theme of the Renaissance uses of space. Linear perspective is the technique of drawing straight line objects, mostly architecture, pavements, geometric shapes, and so on, in such a way that they correspond perfectly to what you would trace on a window pane if you were looking at an actual scene. In the 20th century, but not in the Renaissance, linear perspective was described as the, quote, rationalization of sight. Perspective uses the x, y, and z axes of Euclidean space. But again, the Renaissance artists and mathematicians didn't draw x, y, and z axes. The xy graph that every high school student has to draw is usually called Cartesian. That would be 17th century, after the Renaissance, Descartes. But it was actually not used until the 19th century. Graph paper was not used until the 19th century. This illustration is from a Renaissance treatise. It's true that the observer here is in a Euclidean XYZ space, but the author of this Renaissance treatise was not using those ideas or even thinking of them. Perspective was also said in the 20th century to be rational because it reduces the viewer, you, the artist, to a single geometric point, or an eye, like you see in this typical diagram. But again, in the Renaissance, no one congratulated anyone else for rationalizing sight. That's a judgment, expressing, by the way, pride in Western culture, that came afterward. The value of rationalizing is an Enlightenment value, and the expression rationalizing sight is 20th century. It actually comes from a book by William Ivins on the rationalization of sight, 1938. Perspective did open the way to navigation, including eventually space travel, and it did enable the development of photography, but the values placed on those achievements are only stressed in later texts. Cultures that did not develop perspective, like China, India, and the Americas, didn't participate in that literature. So, it's surprising that the word space, spazio in Italian, spatium in Latin, does not appear in any book on architecture before the 18th century. The entire Renaissance, including the first artists who used perspective, did not need to talk about space. They talked about forms instead, the objects they drew and the buildings they designed. So actual Renaissance treatises that have in them images like this from a late Renaissance treatise, they're all about actually drawing the spiral staircase and all the fancy recession and the open doorway and all the rest of that. They got along well without the word space and all the things that go along with it, including the pride in having rationalized sight and all the rest of that. So the idea that space is universal comes from Kant. So it's 18th century, well after the Renaissance, who said that space and time are what he called intuitions, meaning that they're immediately present to all of us, without concepts. They're like built-in, instinctive, quote-unquote, capacities. The intuition of space permits all humans to understand their place in the world. That's the Kant's claim. And his philosophy was enormously influential. Echoes of his claim can be found in art writing that assumes space is neutral, universal, foundational element of experience. In the late 19th century, there was interest in ways of depicting space other than perspective. One of the writers here is Guido Hauck, a mathematician, who promoted a kind of perspective called curvilinear perspective. It was a way of drawing that preserves curves that we all experience when we look back and forth at a long wall or railroad tracks. This is a whimsical illustration in a kind of a bird's eye view from the point of view of the person drawing. But a more typical example of curvilinear perspective, the kind that Hauck was promoting, would be a drawing like this, which captures the fact that if you stand in front of a long wall or anything that's stretching from left to right and you turn your head left to right and look at it, you will see that it curves. And if you're really careful at life drawing and you make a careful drawing of furniture in a room that's lined up but is far to your left and far to your right, you'll see that in your drawing you have to make these curves to include those forms. So curvilinear perspective is a way of recording a subjective element of experience that actually produces curves where linear perspective says there should be straight lines. Hauck in the 19th century was the first one to write about this at any length, and there have been a number of revivals of it and advocates for it since then. In the early 20th century, the art historian Erwin Panofsky used Hauck's theories to advance his own account of what he called psychophysiological space. That is, the lived, embodied experience of space, which is often not geometrical. So a book missing from a bookcase, for example, can leave a space that looks like it's too small for the book to fit back into. It's just a subjective impression that we have. A stairway looks deeper from the top looking down than from the bottom looking up. Again, it's subjective, having to do with our experience and fear of falling and things like that. In the early 20th century, there was also research on animal vision, which cast ideas about space in a completely different light. There was an Estonian biologist named Jakob Johan von Uexküll, it's a great name, who theorized about what he called the Umwelt of animals. Umwelt is the experienced space, the world around the animal, as the animal experiences it. So what you have here is two pair of drawings showing how the world is, what the world looks like to a sea urchin, that's the bottom, and what the world would look like to us. So sea urchin doesn't see, and so there are these black blobs over the cloud and the ship and the fish to indicate the sea urchin's Umwelt. Uexküll did this for a number of different animals, and he was very imaginative and very thoughtful about the idea that there are different senses of space and different kinds of experiences. There's a paper from about this same time that tries to claim mathematically that lemurs experience non-Euclidean spaces. There were a number of attempts like this in the early 20th century to try to establish that animals experience space in quantifiably different ways. These are all examples of the development of phenomenology, a way of thinking about the body's experience in the ways that it's different from Euclidean rational perspectival space. The principal philosopher of phenomenology is Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who was very strident in his criticism, his disapproval of rationalized scientific world and the space that it's given us all. So I'm just epitomizing the kind of art that Merleau-Ponty would have found more congenial, as a painting by Miro, which shows spaces that are not obviously in any way Euclidean. So phenomenologically, there's a lot to be said for the fact that we don't necessarily experience anything like rational Euclidean XYZ perspectival space, but we experience space in different ways, maybe as curvilinear, and maybe more generally as something like an Umwelt. We have our own subjective spaces. Phenomenology is the current consensus way to think about space in artworks, including performance. Most writers on body-centric performance art use variations on phenomenological understandings of space, like Amelia Jones, whose book is here, and Peggy Phelan and others. So on matter and form, I'm treating this like an entirely separate topic, and in some ways it is. So I'm going to introduce philosophic terms for matter and form, distinguishing them and other terms that are like them. So back to Aristotle. He distinguished between hyle, which is the matter out of which the world is made, and eidos, which is the visible form of things. For Aristotle, matter, hyle, is not visible as matter, as such. Hyle consists of the four elements, which he called archai, of fire, water, air, and earth. This is Aristotle's idea of what matter is. And note that his words have often changed meaning since his time. So eidos has a different meaning these days in Greek than the word that he used. So, but thinking of Aristotle here. And that's an early edition of one of Aristotle's books. I mean, early, post-Renaissance edition, English translation. He wrote about strange and wondrous people that live in different parts of the world, as well as matter and form. So an example in the visual art might be the formula for clay slip. That's clay particles in water mixed to the consistency of cream. Aristotle would have said that the matter, hyle, of slip is made of water and earth. Those are invisible elements. The form, eidos, of clay slip is cream. It's cream-like. Aristotle made another distinction between form that is latent, that has a tendency toward some end. He called that energeia, and form that's fully actualized, which he called entelecheia. Again, the words don't necessarily correspond to modern Greek. Entelecheia means integrity. And that is a photograph of mud in Norwich, in England, by the artist Debbie Leiden. An example in visual art might be clay before it's molded. That would be energeia, latent shape, and as opposed to the final vessel, entelecheia, fully realized form. So latent shape is visible, unlike these other distinctions, but it is visible in a different way because it disappears, giving way to the final vessel. Aristotle said that everything has four causes. These four causes were very widely studied in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, had a lot of influence since the Renaissance. The material cause of anything in the world, is the matter that comprises the object, hyle. The formal cause is the object's form, its eidos. The efficient cause is the agent that transforms the matter into form, that's the artist. And the final cause is the purpose. Aristotle's word is telos for that, for which the object is made. So in this way, in Aristotle's theory, the invisible essences of things that comprise objects are tied in a list like this all the way to the object, the purpose for which the object is made. So making an artistic creation, that would be number 3, and commerce, dissemination, meaning, interpretation, all the rest of that would be the 4th. So it's a good conceptualization. It's a strong conceptualization because it ties things that seem to be just matters of raw material or even philosophy of nature. It ties them to creation of artworks. Everything has these 4 causes. There they are again. Notice that if you look at things this way, you, the artist, are part of a chain that leads from the matter that you start with to the form that you create to you, and then on into the world. This topic continues in lecture 17 on Heidegger and matter and materiality, so there's more to come on this. So I conclude with some examples of non-Western space and form. There is no or almost no account of what kinds of space and form happen outside of Western influence. So instead of an overview, I'm just going to provide an example. Example here is the Ryoanji Rock Garden in Kyoto, in Japan. It's Muromachi period, so it's 15th century. Currently, there are 15 stones in it with raked white pebbles in between. You can see the rake lines there. So it's just a rectangular space with rocks and some moss. There are a number of Western misunderstandings about this garden. It's been said that it's very important that all 15 rocks can't be seen at once, no matter where you're standing. At least one is hidden. It's been said that they represent islands in an ocean. And it's also been said that Ryoanji Garden has hidden axes of symmetry, that these islands are placed in such a way that they correspond to complicated geometries. So here are 3 different examples of that kind of a theory. The geometries of the rock, quote-unquote, islands in Ryoanji, how they're supposedly related. It doesn't, of course, it's not a good sign when 3 different schema are completely different from each other, and yet they're supposedly all right. This is David Hockney's photo collage, where he shows his own feet at the bottom as he walks back and forth. You're allowed to walk along one side of this, so that's him walking back and forth along that side. I'm taking a series of pictures and arranging them into a basically perspectival view, but without the kind of recession to the vanishing point that you would expect in a single photograph of this space. So all those assumptions are all Western and later, and even though some of them are adopted in Japanese literature for tourists. There's a book called Mumonkan, or The Gateless Passage, and there's another called The Blue Cliff Record, which was originally Chinese and from the Song Dynasty. Those are both sources for the Zen teachings. This is, I should say, the Ryoanji Rock Garden is part of a Zen monastery. So these books are sources for the Zen teachings that contradict the puzzles that Western scholars propose about Ryoanji. Zen awareness is not perspectival or spatial, and it has nothing to do with puzzles that can be solved by geometry or naturalism. So I chose this example because there would have been many examples of artworks where it would have been plausible to say this has a slightly different sense of space or a very different sense of space, and there would be examples where I could cite the word for space in the culture in question. But this example is more radical because this rock garden actually doesn't have anything to do with space. It's not a spatial construct. When I visited a long time ago in 2000 or so, right before you went out to this garden, there was a table which had on it this miniature replica rock garden for the visually impaired. So the sand in this is glued down. So if you're visually impaired, before you go out in front of the rock garden, you could feel this. Sorry, go back to that. You could feel this. And then you could walk a few more steps and stand on that edge where you're allowed to stand, where David Hockney walked. Even if you were totally unsighted, you could then experience the rock garden with the feeling of this in your mind. So this was set up by the monks in the monastery. One conclusion you can draw from this is that Ryoanji seems spatial because we're so used to space, and it seems perspectival, which is supposedly impossible to see all the rocks from one point of view and so on. It seems perspectival, but it's not. It's not spatial in any easily translatable sense. It's about mental images. It's true, it seems very likely true that those rocks would be suggestive of islands, but every other of those ideas about Ryoanji is a misperception. So space and form belong to specifically Western and ultimately Italian culture, but they've become so common that it's very difficult to remember that fact, to keep it in mind. And it's even more difficult to speak about art without using space or form entirely. Technically, however, all art outside of European post-Renaissance influenced art should be discussed without using the words space and form. That's basically impossible if you're speaking English, but conceptually, it's a really good challenge.